It's time to get going with the David Clayton Smith lecture, which has become an annual part of our Institute Symposium. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Kurt Mosch, who probably really needs no introduction, but here he is, professor in the School of Earth and Climate Sciences at the Climate Change Institute, published over 60 peer-reviewed scientific journals across a range of meteorological, climatological, paleoclimate topics, and history too now, with what he's going to talk to us about today with his recent book. So, Kurt, thank you.
Thank you very much. So, what I'm going to tell you about today is a story which is ongoing and will continue to go on probably for the rest of my life. And I will continue to work with Hal as long as I can. I have to say that both Hal and I miss Dave in many ways. In particular, when I start to go down the road of a historian, which I always dreamt of being. I love history. It was my favorite topic in school, along with science. I come to questions which might be second nature to someone who's classically trained as a historian. And I miss the days when I could just ask Dave, because he would know. So when I run up against a roadblock or how to find something or do it the way a historian would, I miss having Dave there to ask questions. When I came to the University of Maine way back in October of 1991, I began early on enjoying long conversations with Dave and with Hal about things related to history. In particular, I've always had this affinity for oral history. So when I meet people who have been around in a field or around a subject that is very interesting to me, I always ask a million questions. And their firsthand experiences and second and third hand experiences are something that I want them to pass on to me. And I don't remember exactly how far into being here I was when I saw this hand-bound, old-looking stack of papers, manuscript, in Hal's office on top of his map case, which was the manuscript that I'm going to talk about today, which was written by John Delasky in the 1860s and remained unpublished, sadly, until this year, when we just posthumously got it published for him. But in any event, I asked Hal, what is this? And he told me the story, and I've heard the story over and over and over again from where it came from. It's tracked through this world for the last 150 years, and I'll share that with you today. But I remember him telling me that the first time that Dave saw it, his words, which we have in the dedication of the book to Dave, was, "Who is this Delasky? Who is this John Delasky?" And so we set out as a club, if you will. We met regularly for spans of time, and then there'd be a hiatus, and we'd meet regularly once a week. And we would talk about this manuscript and what it meant in the context of the history of the glacial theory and the Ice Age imprint upon the landscape of Maine. And we aspired to write a book about what John Delasky had accomplished and done in his lifetime. And that book has yet to be finished, because the book that we just published is essentially Delasky's manuscript with a little bit of metadata about the book and where it came from and a little bit about who he is. But we didn't, in this particular venture, go into establishing within the context of what scientists and people in general knew back in the day, how ahead of its time it was in many ways, and how it fit into the paradigm of the day. And we still want to do that. Thankfully, the most progress that we made towards that book, and we have a long ways to go, but the progress that we did make was largely what Dave was good at. He sorted through a lot of the literature and the books of the time and wrote some drafts of the the chapters that he would be able to do if he was still here. And the part of it that we have not tackled head on, the way that I hope that we will in the next year or two, is to go back and retrace the steps of John Delaski across the main landscape with a GPS, a digital camera, and a Brunt compass, and all that stuff in hand. Because one thing that we don't have from him are his sketches, his maps, and things of that sort. And so we would like to go to many of the places and the paths that he went and see and experience what he did to the extent that we can, and then put that into the historical context of the story that he was telling, with also the additional knowledge of the way the world works in ways that were unknown to people in the middle of the 19th century. In particular, why and how mountains get where they are, and continental drift or tectonics, things of that sort. They didn't know why the land was going up and down, but they know that it did. And so we can fill in the gaps with that as well. So I'm going to tell you the story about the book and about Delaski and what we've done, and then end up with just some sketchy idea of the way that glacial theory had come to be what it was in the time of John Delaski at the end. Here he is. We were fortunate enough to get 2 photographs of Dr. Delaski from a relative of his, who, upon seeing on our institute website about 13 years ago, an abstract that we gave at this symposium in 2003, I believe, and she said, "Ooh, I'm excited. I'm related to this guy. Would you like some photographs of him?" Otherwise, we wouldn't have the likeness of him. Although maybe they have it at the Vinyl Haven Historical Society too.
Yes.
We got them from her, but I guess that she gave it to the Historical Society. Anyway, here he is in one of the pictures we have. We don't know what happened to the hat. I wish I had the hat. Mine was there. His day job was medical doctor. He was the medical doctor at least from the 1850s until his death in 1874 in various parts of Maine, mostly in what were then known as the Fox Islands. Vinyl Haven, Carver's Harbor is where his office was, but he was also in North Haven for part of the time. And as it turns out, I found out after the fact, in looking through everything that I could find about him and where he went on the internet, he actually lived in Islesboro for a couple of years. So in and around Penobscot Bay. There was this manuscript that I alluded to. This is the title page of it underneath the cover, and it's called The Footsteps of the Ancient Great Glacier of North America, and it's by a member of the Portland Natural History Society. That member is John Delaski. And the manuscript, as you can see, is in a handwriting which takes some time to interpret. But I caught a break that I'll tell you about in a little while. I did have to read everything he wrote and decipher what it was, but I had help, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And below is a quotation that Delaski puts on his title page from Professor James Dwight Dana from his Manual of Geology, the edition that was published in 1868, I believe. J.D. Dana was at Yale University and was the editor of the American Journal of Science, which was the science magazine of the day, so to publish things. It was a very highly visible journal, and when you published there, anyone who cared about the science fields would see it the way that they do in the high-profile journals of today. J.D. Dana was the son-in-law of Benjamin Silliman, who started the journal in, I believe, 1818, and was often referred to as Silliman's Journal. Here is a certificate that was given to the members of the Portland Society of Natural History. This is not the one that Delaski had his name on. No one knows what happened to that. We obtained this certificate from the collection at the Portland Historical Society when we went there. I'll show you some pictures of Hal and Dave at the Historical Society in our endeavor to learn what we could about Dr. Delaski. So we don't know when he joined. We know that he gave the manuscript to them, and the date in pen on it is 1869. So it was sometime 1869 or a little after. Delaski died in 1874, but how long he was a member of the society prior to that, we don't know. It had many prominent members. It was actually a very, very high world-class collection of natural history. It was at the level of the collections at Harvard and Yale and the Boston Society for Natural History. It was extremely complete collection and very diverse collection as well. Its story alone could have a lecture on it. It was started in about, I believe, 1843, and it lasted until the early 1970s when it met a horrific and very, very tragic demise. It also endured two catastrophes in the 19th century, one in 1854, when its location at that time on Middle Street in Portland burned to the ground, and then the Great Fire of 1866 that took out a good portion of Portland, got the building that it was in then. With a very, very hard work and diligence and a lot of backbreaking labor, people got a lot of the materials out of it before the building was consumed. And it relocated to this location on Elm Street, which today, sadly, is a parking lot right now.
Yeah.
And there it stayed through the 1960s to about 1970 when the doors were closed. And rather than do what was smart and right and just the correct thing to do, the contents of it, if they weren't sent off to another collection, which some of them were just essentially given out. This is a newspaper article that came out in 1970 in the Portland newspaper that says, Portland History Society surplus is up for grabs. And these kids got that stuffed alligator. They were just pitching it. I mean, they got rid of a whole bunch of very, very valuable things. I mean, some of the really important collections did go to museums at universities and other museums around the country, but a lot of the stuff, including a lot of the paper goods they had journals, they had letters, they had all kinds of handwritten records and things of that sort, were just put into, I think they put it into a big warehouse kind of a deal first on Baxter Boulevard, because what happened is the society was, they called it merged with the Maine Audubon Society, but really the Maine Audubon Society took what they wanted from the collection, trashed the rest of it, and just took the name away, and it was just the Maine Audubon Society. And so they had a headquarters on Baxter Boulevard, but a lot of the paper goods went to a warehouse someplace in South Portland. It was a former factory or something like that. It had leaks in the roof.
A lot of it went to a fort in the middle of
Fort Williams. It was Fort Williams in South Portland.
With moldy water and everything.
So it really was not treated with any care whatsoever. But the manuscript survived. And Hal acquired the manuscript after the dismantling, along with some other items. And the other very, very important thing, aside from, here's the actual cover of the manuscript. See, it's dated May 1869, John Delaski, and the short title, The Ancient Great Glacier of North America. So thankfully, Hal got it along. I guess you got some other items too, including the tusk that we have from Alaska and some other things. But this was an important thing to be saved. Otherwise, I wouldn't be telling you the story today, and it wouldn't have 20 years of fun with Hal and Dave either. There was another man who was very, very interested and recognized the importance of what Delaski had done and what was left by Dr. Delaski to the society. And this was Arthur H. Norton, who was the curator of the Portland Society of Natural History from 1905 until 1943. And what he did was, in the 20s, he had the manuscript typed. So that saved me a lot of effort, because even though the typewriter was up and down and the fonts weren't perfect, OCR still works on it. So I got about 85% of what I needed to transcribe, maybe 80% in, with lots of typos and things. And then I just had to read side by side the OCR. I say just. Took me months of working 3 or 4 hours a day in the summer last year to finally buckle down and do it. So it was by no means an easy task. But thanks to Norton, there was the typewritten manuscript. But not only did he have that done, he tried to use the type version that he had to parade before publishers. He tried to publish the book like we just did successfully back in the 20s. The other thing he did was other paper letters and some papers and things of that sort that Dulaski had donated to the society he had all together in one file. And that, unlike the manuscript which Hal got his hands on, the other paper goods went to the special collections in the library here in Orono, which we visited and got what we could out of that and got some information about him as well. Well, here's that title page that I showed you before with the quote from Dana. Here's what it is in typewritten form, and that's what the document that I could optically character recognized looked like. Well, on September 8th of 1923, Arthur H. Norton received a letter from the publisher that he tried to get to do this book, which says, "I am returning to you by American Express the manuscript of the Footsteps of the Ancient Great Glacier of North America by John Dulaski. I've gone over the manuscript thoroughly, and it seems to me that expensive publishing such a book greatly out of proportion to its value." They turned it down. The manuscript contains some interesting and valuable detail. I doubt if much of it could be called an important contribution to our present-day knowledge of the geology of Maine. The manuscript is more of an interest as an historical than a scientific document. Now that is true. I mean, by then everyone knew that there was a glacial and that there were ice ages and that the landscape of Maine was sculpted by glaciers. So there is historic content to it. If it had been published back in its day, it would have been ahead of its time in the completeness that it was written. So anyway, he failed, but he helped us by doing that. So as I said, Hal and Dave and I used to like to get together during the semesters after Hal retired, after Dave retired and ultimately Hal retired. We like to stay in active meetings with one another. So we would typically choose a day of the week in the semester that we would choose to do this and meet in Hal's office after my class got out or what have you. And we would talk in general about things, and Dulaski was often the topic of conversation. We were plotting and planning our book. But sometimes we went away too. And one of the most memorable weekends of my life, and to see a place that was so unlike anything I ever saw in my world, was in 2003. Hal and Dave and I went up to Dave's camp in Topsfield, the middle of sort of nowhere, and on Musquash Lake. And it was surreal for me because I got to be with two people who were walking history books, because we didn't only talk about Dulaski, but I heard everything about the University of Maine for the 50 years that they were here themselves, plus what they knew about what happened before. Some great stories about ski jumps for the ski team going out onto the still water, about sailing, a sailing team that was co-ed that had to get kids down to the coast that were male and female, and the chaperones didn't like the girls sitting on the lap of the guys, so they made to put a newspaper between them. I remember you told me all the stories, and I lived up to the nickname I had in my family growing up, Why Kirk. I just wouldn't stop asking questions. But we talked about the Dulaski book, and we plotted and planned and made progress, always. And we really had a good time. When we took Hal's Jeep around, he's got that nice Ice Age license plate right there, and Dave showed me something. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Topsfield before, but there's many acres of the woods that have more junk in them than a major landfill in a city. And Dave told me the whole history and the story of it. I mean, it was just like refrigerators and TVs and everything, just stacked up buses and car hulks and things like that. It was really surreal. They showed me all that. And there was a fire tower too. There's a hill right across the street from Dave's camp, has one of the old fire spotting towers on it, and it was safe enough for me to climb to the top. So I got panoramic views. It was phenomenal. But we talked about the Lasky, and we concocted a story at the time that led us to give this presentation at what was then called the Agassiz Symposium. Now the Bourne Symposium. It should have been Bourne's for longer than it was. I'll get into Agassiz a little bit at the end, the scoundrel that he was. But we wanted to know about not only his life, but what people knew back then in the context of the debate between why the landscape looked like it did. And so we got a loose list together of every publication that we could find evidence of that was written by Lasky in addition to the handwritten manuscript. And here it is. And I'm going to show you some of these pretty much in sequential order of how they came to us. But here we are at the camp again. How apropos to see a log truck passing by the Smith residence, as Dave was one of the experts that wrote the book on how logging and paper industry worked in the state of Maine. And there's Dave going into the camp. Right out the back window is Musquash Lake, there are loons, the whole 9 yards. Real Maine experience for me. And here's Hal lounging before dinner. They didn't have much, if any of it, but they made sure to bring enough beer for me for the trip. And we ate well. I cooked for them, and it was fun. Later, we continued to collect information down in Portland. Dave showed me how to navigate a historical society from a historian's standpoint. It was winter, it was cold, but we went in there and we came away with, he knew who to ask to get these boxes exhumed from the back right quick. And we looked through them, and although you weren't supposed to make copies of anything in it, they sort of looked the other way when I did make a copy or two of some things. I think it was because they knew Dave and they were just going to let us get away with it. So now a little bit about his life that we deciphered. Here's the other photo we have of him looking real doctorly right here. Besides being a medical doctor, he obviously was also a pretty good geologist or geological observer. He was also a very accomplished poet as well. And we have some of his poetry. Some of the poems were about geological themes, but others were about issues of the day, including abolition and things like that, because the heart of the work that I'm about to describe to you was right in the center of the Civil War. The Civil War was raging. And so when I was reading newspaper articles of his publications, because that was one of the venues that was commonly used for scientists of that day to get the word out, I couldn't stop myself from spending hours that I really didn't have reading about what was going on in the war, because it was on the front page right next to his articles. He was married, well, he was born in 1814 in Nova Scotia. His parents came from Poland, from what we know. I don't have an official record of that, but in the census data that I have gotten on him, it does say that his parents were foreign born. So he was a first generation here in North America. And from Nova Scotia, he came into Maine. We know there was an official entry through the Port of Bangor in 1833, but he was in Maine before that. In things that we've read between the lines and little anecdotes in some of the stuff that came from the Norton collection at the special collections here in the library, he talks about his youth and being up in an Irish Catholic town, right? And you have a suspicion, Hal, where that is.
Benedicta.
Probably Benedict.
One of them.
Yeah. We're not certain because he doesn't name it by name. It's somewhere in the, yeah. And so, but he talks about, even as a youth, recognizing that a little stream with boulders and things in it that don't fit that size of stream, they fit a much larger one. He wondered about that from an early age. And he also makes reference to spending time as a youth with a Deacon Farrington in Holden as well. In any event, in 1839, he married Anne Vaughan Wise, who was from Maine, And together they had 8 children. And the reason that I found out about the kids was because I wanted to know where they were born, because that gave me an indication of where he was through that span of time. As it turns out, his oldest, Ada Delasky, was born in St. Stephen's, New Brunswick, which means that he was either living in Canada or more likely he went across the border to the hospital there. Didn't you tell me that there was a hospital there? That people did that if they needed a hospital. And then his second in Elliottsville. Then he was in the Quebec area for the mid-1840s. By 1848, when Edgar Delasky was born, who later legally changed his name to Shaw, we don't know why. Troy is by Dixmont, so it's the Bangor area that he's in by that point. And I'll show you the 1850 census in a moment. It was Brooksville in 1850 is where he's listed on the census. And then Henry Delasky was born in 1850. He was on that 1850 census, but he didn't make it through the year. He's buried in Bangor in the Mount Hope Cemetery. And then Walter was born in 1852, and William, who didn't last a year either, lasted only a week, was born. They were born in Vinyl Haven, and that was when he was the doctor in Vinyl Haven. And I don't have the hard copy of the 1860 census, but in 1860 and 1870 in the U.S. Census, he was in Vinyl Haven. So he did move about a bit, and we know he walked about a lot from what I'm going to show you in a moment. Henry Delasky, William Delasky, and Anne Vaughan Wise Delasky, the mother, who died also in 1854, are buried in the Mount Hope Cemetery. And being compulsive and liking graveyards, especially garden cemeteries like Mount Hope, I was hell-bent on finding that grave. It took me about 8 years of wandering around that graveyard when I had lunch there and took walks in that beautiful graveyard to find it. And I accidentally found it in the winter of 2006 when my daughter was doing a science fair project on weathering of marble gravestones. And we were out in the snow up to here with calipers measuring the gravestones, and accidentally found it. It was in a part of the cemetery that has no records because they only have official records of people born there, buried there, and where they're buried from the Civil War on. And she died in 1854. But I found it. I told Hal where it was. He's gone and seen it as well. So here's a map of the state of Maine, which you're familiar with. And so he was born in Nova Scotia, and he lived in here in the Quebec area. He lived in Brooksville. He lived over here, and then he lived down in Penobscot Bay. And he spent some time down in Falmouth as well. And his daughter lived in Lynn, Massachusetts. He used to go down there too, and he ultimately was buried in Lynn, Massachusetts as well. So the first thing that we came across, that we found, not in order, but ultimately found, of things that were written by him and published, was this multi-part article that was published in the Bangor, in the Daily Whig and Courier, which is the daily paper in Bangor. And this was published in 1847 between the 7th and the 11th of September. And what it is it's a description. Here it's attributed to by one of the party. Aaron Young, who was the state botanist, led an expedition up to the top of Mount Clayton. And Delasky went along, and he chronicled it, and he wrote it up. He must have been a freelance writer at the time, or maybe he was an employee of the newspaper. I don't know. But he wrote this wonderful account of going up Mount Katahdin, and there had been several ascents to that point, maybe 8 or 10, by European descended people, but not a lot of people went out. The year before the Young party, along with Delasky attached, went up there in 1846, Henry David Thoreau attempted an ascent of Katahdin, and his party did not make the summit. I think Pomola had a different idea in mind, didn't let him up to the top, but he got close. But a couple of years, several years later, Thoreau published his famous book, The Maine Woods. And in it is the essay called Katahdin. And in that essay, there is a quote by a mysterious one that reads, "Hundreds of lakes and rivers sparkled in the swath of the forest far below." Now here's the quote right here. Thoreau described the scene as a mirror broken into 1,000 fragments and wildly scattered over the grass, reflecting the full blaze of the sun. And that metaphor he attributed to none other than John Delaski, and was published in his book, The Maine Woods, right here. And many people have quoted this passage from Thoreau's book and not giving Delaski the credit for it, which is in itself a metaphor for what happened to him scientifically. He didn't get the recognition and the credit that he so just deserved. But this brings out the what I told you, that he had a poet in him too. He's very good with words. So here's the 1850 census, just to follow it along. And there's his family. There were 6 children at the time. Henry's at the bottom. He dies before 1851 is over. And they're in Brooksville right here in Hancock County. Then we know that he was in Islesboro for a while, because in the history of Islesboro, which was published in the late 1890s, I believe, it says that John Delaski came from Fox Island, which is Vinyl Haven. Man, good education, skillful physician, stayed only 2 or 3 years, then he moved back to Fox Island again as well. So it was in the late 1850s that we began to see things that he wrote and published concerning glacial activity and the glacial evidence in the state of Maine. And one of the first things that I know of was this letter, which is dated Vinyl Haven, August 20th, 1859, which he submitted to appear in the, he submitted it to Charles Hitchcock to go into the 6th annual report of the Maine Board of Agriculture, 1860 to 61. And in it, he's talking about what's going on in and around the Fox Islands and in Carver's Harbor in particular, which is where he lived. So he basically started his formal description and analysis of the glacial features of Maine right in his backyard in Carver's Harbor, where there was quarrying going on, and he recognized that a lot of quarrying happened by some other thing before people were there, which was the glaciers, these huge blocks that were moved and erratics and all the things that we now just take for granted. At this time, even Hitchcock himself were more akin to believing the deluge hypothesis. That is, that the erratic boulders and the scratches and the diluvium, if you will, across the landscape was brought by large floods or by waters that inundated lower continents that had icebergs floating through, scratching, bumping, dumping rocks and things of that sort. And Delaski was very, very quick to recognize that this just didn't make any sense at all. So his letter, although it went against the so-called conventional wisdom at the time, at least here in Maine, was published. This is just a map to show some of the places that he went at the beginning of his exercises. Vinyl Haven is where he lived in Carver's Harbor down here, but he also lived in North Haven, and then he lived in Islesboro for a while. And before that, he had lived over in Brooksville, and then there was a time when he lived, as you know, over here in Troy, where his son was born. And as you'll see from when I show you the names of the chapters that we gave to the book, because when he wrote the book, he didn't name the chapters. He just named them chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, on through 26. So we gave them names, and the names that I chose were where he was going or where he was when he did it. And you'll see a lot of these place names in that. This is what Carver's Harbor and Vinyl Haven looked like on a map right at the time that he was actively looking at this. So you can't really read it, but in his manuscript, he refers to some of the landowners, and I can match them up with their names are right on this map. It's not unlikely that he had this, not this physical copy of the map, but a copy of this map that was published in 1859, because he lived there and he probably would get the newest map that he could. A few years later, there was the 7th annual report to the Secretary of the Board of Agriculture, and he submitted another letter, this time to George Goodale. And again, he's talking about glaciation that's happening in and around Penobscot Bay. He's expanding from Vinyl Haven and from the Fox Islands and his backyard to start to look around Penobscot Bay at large. The biggest thing that came across in terms of a synthesis before the big synthesis of the book was published in 1862 as a series of 8 articles in the Rockland Gazette. The first half of them were published in July on the 12th, the 19th, the 26th, and then in October there were 4 more installments in which he details in excruciating detail the evidence that Penobscot Bay and all the evidence on the ground could absolutely, unequivocally, no way, no how, been brought about by icebergs and floods. And it had to be glacial ice. And he concluded by the end of his Penobscot Bay, if not before, endeavor, that it couldn't have just been a glacier that went down the valley of the Penobscot because of the thicknesses and the volumes that he inferred. It had to be one that went across a large lateral distance, at least from way into eastern Canada back into the central part of the Great Lakes region of the United States. So he knew there was an ice sheet by the time he was done with this. And Dave explained to me how to do it, got the microfilm from the Rockland Library, and the articles, I went to the microfilm reader over here in the library, and it was before you could get digital copies of them, or at least I didn't know how to at the time. So one day I'll have to get this again, because I can't find these anywhere digitized online, at least without having to pay for them. You might be able to do it if you pay for them. Okay, so I said that he didn't get the recognition that you might expect he would have gotten based on the quality and the scope of what he did. But there were some scientists, prominent ones, in the United States and in Europe who did recognize what he did and did give a citation to him. And one of them was the aforementioned James Dwight Dana, who, here is the copy of one of the editions of his book, The Manual of Geology. And in this book, there is a footnote and an acknowledgement to what's going on in Maine attributed to John Delaski. So we know that Dana was aware of what Delaski was doing. And I don't know if it was because he had some connection or some tie to the Portland Society. He may have. I know that Agassiz was an honorary member. And Louis Agassiz, in all of the things that he's written that I have seen, and every piece of writing that Hal or Dave has seen, we cannot find any mention of John Delaski. And yet, as I'll tell you, we're convinced that they were together, and Agassiz knew everything, but he just didn't give him any acknowledgement for it, which was Agassiz's MO. I mean, he burned a lot of bridges when he left Europe, and a lot of people hated him to the day they died because of the things that he did. But anyway, Dana acknowledges him, and Dana was, as I mentioned, the chief editor of Silliman's Journal, of the American Journal of Science. And he invited John Delaski. We don't have the official letter for it, but in between the lines and reading things, we know that he encouraged Delaski to submit for publication a summary of these articles that he wrote for the Rockland Gazette as a paper in the American Journal of Science, which is exactly what he did. And in the May edition of the 1864 American Journal of Science, an article called "The Glacial Action About Penobscot Bay" by Mr. John Delaski was published. Now, we do know that Dana was the editor. We also know that one of the other editors, associate editors, was Professor Louis Agassiz of Cambridge. So we know that the guy saw this. Now, Agassiz came to Maine in 1864 for the first time, and went from, you'll see curiously a parallel, he went up to the base of Katahdin. He didn't go to the top of it. From Bangor up to the base of Katahdin, to the ironworks. He came back to Bangor, and he went down what is now Route 3, or that direction, to MDI. Exact paths that Delaski has gory detail in his book. And he went with somebody. Somebody met him at the train station. Hal and Dave are 100% convinced that it was Dulesky that he met. I don't know if it was or not, but he went on the same path, and he immediately, upon getting into Maine, so the scratches in Ellsworth and the stria here and the erratics and everything, it's almost as if he was rehearsed before he did it. I'm not saying he couldn't recognize those features without, but I'm pretty sure that Dulesky either was with him or he did read Dulesky's work, and he came in October of 1864. This was in print in May of 1864. Curiously, I came across this book only about a year ago. It's called A Short American Tramp in the Fall of 1864. And on the book itself, it says, by the editor of Life in Normandy. But in handwritten here, and you can search this online, it's written by a man named John Francis Campbell, who was a Scot, who decided that he wanted to test the idea that was still prevalent in Europe, that the features on the landscape were either the result of icebergs and a flood or glaciers, exactly what Dulesky was wrestling with. So he decided in 1864, this book was published in 1865, he decided that he would come to North America. So he got on a ship from England, and he sailed to Newfoundland, and he went down from Newfoundland into Labrador, into Maine, into the White Mountains, across New York, and ultimately ended up as far west as St. Louis. And he got off the train here, there, and everywhere and looked at the evidence on the ground, and it was obvious to him that it was a glacier that did everything. So curiously, he was coming through Maine right in 1864, in the months right between when Dulesky's AJS paper came out in May and when Agassiz got here in October. He was here in, I think, September or August of it. It's a fascinating account. There's a lot more than the glacial part in this book. This guy also wrote a lot of classic things on Gaelic history. He was from, originally his family, he's also known as Young John of Ely, where they make that really good peaty single malt in Scotland. Anyway, so he's a real character. And he describes in real details, again, I can get sidetracked on these things. He's describing Americans in contrast to people from Europe, their habits, the way they behave, the way they spit everywhere, their tobacco, the way that they have one leg because they just came back from the Civil War, and on and on. It's pretty interesting. Dulesky goes on to continue to publish in local newspapers. He was interested not only in that the glaciers did it, but how they worked, and he published this True Theory of Glacier Motion. That was at a time when people didn't really know what we now know about the physics of the way the glaciers work, but within the context of what was known at the time, he did the best he could. And also, in this article, he was refuting some of the commentary by Louis Agassiz in his Alpine Glacial Motion that was published in Atlantic Monthly. So I can tell that Dulesky was very well read. He read what he could get his hands on, and he got his hands on a lot of books and magazines and periodicals and things of that sort. He actually became a naturalized citizen of the United States on January 4th, 1868. This has his correct birth date, but it's listed as New Brunswick, but in the census records earlier that I assume he answered the questions for, he said Nova Scotia. I get this confusion here. He says he's got a port of arrival in 1833 in Bangor, but I suspect he was back and forth across the border a lot more before that. And finally, in 1869, this is prior to the to when he gave the book manuscript in. I'm leading you through his publications. On that time frame, he published On the Motion of Glaciers in the Portland Society of Natural History Proceedings in 1869. And this article, pretty much as it was in here, was later published in 1871 in the American Journal of Science as well. And here's the 1870 census that has him listed solo here in as a physician from Nova Scotia in Vinalhaven, in the Vinalhaven records. He did remarry in 1855 a woman named Elmira Mills after his first wife, Anne Vaughan Wise, died. I don't know what happened to her in the end. I'm not going to show it to you, but we have records from the probate court in 1875, after he died in 74, that list another wife as contesting some of the belongings. So he was married a third time. I forget her name, but the children that he had were the 8 with his first wife. He didn't have any more kids after that we know of. Here's his doctor's office in Vinyl Haven. See, it says Dr. Dulaski's office up on the top. This is from the Historic Society of Vinyl Haven, and that's the fire engine for the island right there. And that building still stands, and there's Dave Smith in front of it. The Dulaski sign is gone. Door is extended up a little bit. It's not white, it's peeling now, but it's the same building, and it's still there. And ultimately, he went back to Mount Katahdin in 1871. He went back up Mount Katahdin again for a second time, and he published an article here in the Geological Papers, but he also published this in the AJS as well in 1872. And so this brings us to near the end of his life. He died in 1874 at the age of 60 years, 6 months, and 2 days. That was at the end of 1874, and he was buried on January 25th of 1875 in the Pine Grove Cemetery in the city of Lynn, Massachusetts, which is where his daughter, Mary Dulaski Newhall, lived for very many years. Probably not coincidentally, he had visited Lynn when he was alive. In fact, I found in the Essex County history book about that county that he actually did a little medicine practicing down in that county. He probably brought his bag with him when he went to visit his daughter. And he also made mention of going in the summer occasionally to Nahant, which is an island just across the water from Lynn, north of Boston, which guess who has a summer home in Nahant? Louis Agassiz. And he went there in the summer. He probably visited Agassiz there. I don't know why he tolerated the guy, because he never gave him credit for anything. As I said, some people did acknowledge Dulaski. And here, with a misspelling, is a citation to Dulaski's work in Maine from a book published in 1874 by James Geikie of Scotland called The Great Ice Age and its relation to the antiquity of man. So in Europe, people did know. I might add also that the book by John Francis Campbell, The American Tramp in North America, he mentions by name John Dulaski. And I wonder if he tried to meet him when he was in Maine, because it was in 1864, right when Dulaski was doing this, and he knew that he was doing this. So here we come to 2015, and look, lo and behold, our dream fulfilled. This is now this, and the world knows. I'll leave it at that.
I'd like to have one comment. If this had been published in 1869, when he finished it, it probably would have been the first book ever published in North America that described the holistics of a city.
Without doubt. There was no other
First
version.
one.
There wasn't one for decades to come. So it really was ahead of its time. And Arthur Norton knew this. We knew this. We persisted. And as I said in the foreword of the book, it was finally published 140 years too late, but it was published, which we're happy for.
All right.
So the next thing is to write a book about what I talked about today in the context of things and really solidify his place in the history books, which I think he deserves.
Great. Thank you, Kirk.
You're welcome.